Great, thanks so much, and welcome back, everyone. I'm sure we're going to have some people coming in as I begin to introduce everyone, but this is a really exciting panel to start up with. My name is David Muraskin. I'm with the Public Justice Food Project. Public Justice is a national legal advocacy organization, and its food project is particularly focused on taking on industrial animal agriculture, the consolidation and exploitation of corporate power that we have been hearing about all morning and will be hearing about all afternoon. I really want to emphasize how much I appreciate the Thurman Arnold Project and the Law, Ethics, and Animals program at Yale for inviting me to be know they'll be continuing to do. On this panel, you're going to hear first from Loka Ashwood and Ryan Thomson and John Canfield. They are sociologists from the University of Kentucky, Auburn, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, all collectively and in order. They're going to be analyzing the connection between financial institutions and pork producers. Then you're going to be hearing from Alan Franco and Danielle Diamond. Alan's with the University of Arkansas, the Agriculture and Food Law program, and Danielle is an advocate against industrial agriculture for years and has worked in the space in a number of different areas. They'll be talking about nuisance law and right to farm statutes. And finally, someone who almost certainly needs no introduction, you'll be hearing from Austin Frerick, who's the deputy director of the Thurman Arnold Project, who's going to be discussing the checkoff programs. While this panel is called systems, I think it's really fair to say, and I think all the panelists will agree, that's really about systems failures. And, in reading their papers, one of the things that I saw throughout was that it's not just the systems failures for any particular reason, but it's systems failures through mission drift and capture. The idea that you see emerge is that institutions, laws, or programs that are created for one end, and particularly to serve a very diversified, bottom-up food system, are now serving another. You'll hear about this through the capture of the Farm Credit Bureau and other financial programs. They're now intertwined with major producers. You'll hear about this through how legal concepts like coming to the nuisance, which were meant to protect small farms from the white flight move to the exurbs, are now being turned against those rural communities they were designed to protect. And finally, hear about this through the discussion of the checkoff programs, and which were designed to be a bottom-up kind of ensure a market base, are now being used to drive farmers from the market. Because I know all of you have been active questioners, I'll actually tee up two of the questions that came to my mind at the beginning, as I appreciate I may very well not get to ask them at the end. So, one of the things that I think you'll see in these papers, and the papers themselves acknowledge, is that while we're talking about antitrust, what they continually reference is also a failure of democracy. Well, that the Citizens United decision and other anti-democratic trends are pushing to allow corporate consolidation in a way antitrust was never really meant to address. And how much do we need to take on that anti-democratic norm in order to eventually move to an antitrust norm? The other thing that I think you'll hear come through in these papers is a problem with transparency, just access to information. How do we kind of get that transparent information out to the public so that we can then build a movement towards either an antitrust trend or a more democratic trend? Like all these other panels, each of the speakers will have about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions. As those of you who have been participating in this conference up till now well know, the best way to submit questions is to do so through me through the private chat function. There's no public chat function unless you have permission. So just send them to me and I'll be reading the questions throughout. You also at the end will be able to raise your hand and we will be able to call on you if you want to ask a question live. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to Loka, Ryan, and John for the beginning of the presentation.
All right, thank you so much. I'm just getting a screen share going. I want to make sure this works for everybody. Can everybody see that? Okay, excellent. Well, David, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thanks so much to Austin and the other organizers who put this together. I think we're all really delighted to have our first chance to present on this 1.5-year ongoing project. And before we get started, I also wanted to give a shout out to our fourth author who is not presenting with us, but played a critical role in this paper, and that's Mariyam Jamila. So thank you so much, Mariyam, and shout out to you. So as David talked about, a big issue is transparency. And as Mary talked about earlier, another big issue with agriculture today is power. Who has the power and who doesn't have it? And how are they executing that power? And so we took the old-fashioned, very simple approach of let's follow the money. Let's figure out where the money is coming from as we follow the hog trail, or what some have called the manure trail, or use some other adjectives to describe, but we're really trying to follow the money trail. And as you'll see, we started with 10 companies, the top 10 pork powerhouses, and that branched out into over 2,000 entities that we analyzed in a network that's much broader and more effusive than we often think of, because we just think about one single pork producer like Tyson or Smithfield, and we'll be talking about that more today. So the backdrop for our interest in this is there's been expansive concentration in the hog industry. So we know now today that 63% of hogs are raised under contract. We also know that 59% of the hog inventory nationally is held in corporations, a staggering number. We know that between 1992 and 2004, the number of hog farms dropped by 70%. So we've had intense consolidation in this industry. Now that's why the hog industry is so interesting to us. But on top of that, what we're very interested in is growing financial investment in agriculture. I think there was a news article circulating amongst many of us in our various circles about how Bill Gates is now the largest owner of farmland in the United States. But it's, of course, not just Bill Gates. It's much more complicated than that. It's, as we talk about in the paper, it's Cargill's Black River Asset Management Fund that they used for investment in energy and trading on the commodities market. And it's just our everyday pension funds that some of us have mandated as part of our jobs that are buying up land to diversify their portfolio. And so there's a debate within our field and the social sciences more generally is how can we figure out how this financial investment is happening and to what scale? But there's one feature of it that hasn't been looked at as much, and that's the concentration of agriculture and credit, the relationship between the concentration of agriculture and concentration in banking and credit at large. So that's what we're really looking at today, is thinking about how can we study not just the productive organization of the hog industry and other producers, but how do we figure out who's crediting them? And how can we trace on a more comprehensive and aggregate scale who's funding that?
And so we begin from kind of this tracing the money approach and use social network analysis, kind of the measuring of social relationships using network math and graph theory. We begin with the top 10 pork producers, looking into LexisNexis database, looking at the comprehensive business reports to find associates, creditors, proprietors, and really began constructing what eventually became a massive data set. Through these comprehensive business reports, we found 2,222 proprietors or creditors, so actors or dots, as you'll see in a moment, with 6,117 total ties, some kind of financial relationship. And so from there, we begin by constructing degree, which is really the easiest measure of centrality, a way of us gauging influential actors within the network. We find that by far the largest was Christensen Farm. We also see Farm Credit, by far the largest creditor in this area, but we also see interesting ones like Golden Plump, 3M being actively involved. We also see others like IBM, Toyota Financial. We ended up finding far more actors than we had ever really imagined. And so once we laid the whole thing out, this is what we see in terms of the total layout of our network. Farm Credit really kind of being the sun there with different pockets concentrated throughout. We have Prestige kind of offsetting Christensen to the right. Christensen getting a lot of influence here because of their structure and their financial ties to so many different crediting agencies. Down in the bottom left, we do see Smithfield kind of broken up, a different structure than we see with, say, Iowa Select, Seaboard, or JBS. And so when we zoom in on farm credit, we actually see that they are tied to more influential actors driving up their eigenvector and other measures, as we clarify in our paper. But ways of looking at these different network actors, and really farm credit is so core to this system, it's hard to gauge, whether you're talking about capture or really just their sheer level of influence and the amount of money being financed through them.
Yes, and as Ryan said, this is something that we're looking forward to maybe some feedback on, because farm credit, as you saw in that first table that we showed, they are not the most powerful actor in terms of their number of ties, but they are the most powerful creditor. So we find that the farm credit system is the center of the crediting universe. And so why is it so important to look at the farm credit system? We started to do a little bit of background research on farm credit, and it was initially created through the Federal Farm Loan Act of 1916. So it's been around for a while, but it's changed dramatically since it was first formulated. Number one, it's consolidated. Initially, it had about 1,000 banks and associations that spread out across the United States to give farmers and rural people access to capital. Now there's 69 entities. So alongside drastic concentration in productive agriculture, we have drastic concentration in the banking industry. And we get into this in our paper. It's not just farm credit. As we mentioned with Fifth Third Bank, there's a drastic concentration in banking at large that affects everyone, not just agriculture. But what's also interesting about farm credit is, although it has this public mandate to serve agriculture, farm credit gets its money essentially through Wall Street. So they sell debt securities, they take the proceeds from that, and the idea is that they distribute it out through associated banks and entities. And those who use those funds, the banks that have real estate portfolios related to them, or the people who are the entities that are giving out the banks, the crucial mechanism of which money is saved for those involved in this is by not paying taxes. So although these are, often we think of farm credit as public, really it has the public benefit of not paying taxes for the banks that are associated with it.
So when examining kind of betweenness values, we found that two of the companies with the greatest betweenness scores are the multinational Smithfield Foods and one of its business associates, Prestige Farms. Although Smithfield is much larger in terms of production, Prestige Farms is the highest ranked producer in terms of betweenness. Now, betweenness measures how much a particular actor exists on paths between other nodes. For example, between creditors and subsidiaries, or parent companies and subsidiaries. So according to the Port Powerhouse report, where we got our original data, Prestige and Smithfield appear to be unconnected, but when you zoom in, as you see here, they turn out to be highly connected, as Prestige Farms is Smithfield's largest contract grower. The way we found this direct connection between Smithfield and Prestige was through Smithfield's subsidiary, Murphy Brown LLC, and its connection to Prestige's business associate, Murphy Farms LLC, a connection we found through the latter's comprehensive business report. And you see that even though the more organizationally complex Smithfield is a far larger firm, Prestige has the most desirable brokerage position to receive benefits through occupying structural holes.
So what do we take away from this presentation that we've been sharing with you today? And I think I want to go back to some of the earlier panels that have really been focusing on power, and especially Mary, Emily, Phil, and Harvey, their discussion of fairness and power, and looking as we have is a real way of identifying who has power and how much of it. So where we're at right now is we're really thinking that our results right now demonstrate an agriculturalization of finance. And what we mean by that is that way that if you look at the weighted degrees that we're looking at and the betweenness, overall, although farm credit is very powerful in Fifth Third Bank, and we don't want to minimize that, is the producers, the productive entities like Smithfield that we were presenting on in Christensen Farms that have the most power in the network when we're considering banks and investors alongside the industrial producers. So we're suggesting that this is agriculture having more power over finance. And so this may be a repeat of the same too big to fail logic that we saw with the Great Recession in 2008. So there may be some parallels there. Also, but that's not to minimize the importance of the farm credit system. If you took out the farm credit system and its publicly mandated benefits, would the top 10 pork powerhouses still be able to exist? As you can see, when we zoomed in on some of those graphics, you don't see small producers as directly tied into the system. So we're seeing the farm credit system directly benefiting the largest of corporate entities. And one other interesting contribution that we'd like to make, and we could get more into this in questions and answers, is that we actually think that sometimes when we just talk about one corporation as having the power, like Smithfield, we're missing that actually the power is coming from many, many corporate entities that they use to limit liability and divert risks, whether that's environmental liability, community liability, labor liability. They divert those risks through the use of many corporate structures. So when we're thinking about power in the agri-food system and we think about single actors, it's actually a system of corporate actors that are associates that are enabling the sustenance of the pork powerhouses. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really, really interesting and a novel way of looking at this. So Alan and Danielle, I believe you are up to talk about nuisance law and right to farm statutes.
I'm gonna try and get my screen shared here. So in sort of piggybacking off what Loka was saying and talking about consolidation of power, for the last 2.5 years, somebody might correct me if I'm wrong, we've been a part of a research team that's been studying US right to farm laws. There are these laws that exist in every state. They're all different in the way that they look, but they generally have the same mission and they have the same underlying political justification. So what we've been doing for the last some time is uncovering through some interdisciplinary research and a survey of all right to farm cases, what's really going on in this almost purely judicial sphere. So our project, when I say it's interdisciplinary, like myself, I'm a litigator. There are several litigators on the project, but there's also Loka and Danielle. If you want to introduce yourself and sort of your background too, I thought that might help here.
Sure. So thanks, Alan. As David mentioned, I've been working in this space for quite some time, and I have, I'm a lawyer as well as, I guess you could call it a community advocate for people that are dealing with the negative impacts of industrial agriculture, primarily the animal agriculture system. And I've been the director of field operations at the Socially Responsible Agriculture Project for a number of years and have worn some other hats as well, but really have had a great deal of experience working directly with communities that are being impacted by right to farm laws and some of the other impacts of our legal system on rural communities.
And I think the difference, I'm purely a litigator. There was another litigator on our project that is big law, and I'm not. I'm more plaintiff's side attorney, and she was more defense. And so we had this really good diversity of viewpoints, trying to merge this traditionally unmerged space of legal research and social science research and really trying to find a way to mesh those things together, because there's not really a good framework for these two disciplines to exist in harmony. There's some rejection, I think, between the two of them. So we spent a lot of time just working within that discipline itself. And in doing that, we've surveyed all of the cases that in some way use right to farm and come up with some findings about what's going on in these cases. And I just wanted to plug where our research is housed with the University of Kentucky, and this one rural idea that I think we'll talk about more, but it's trying to identify those gaps in research and then fill that void. I know that Loka and Danny can talk more about that, and I'll let them do that. They're going to be closer to that vision than I am. But I'm going to hand things over to Danny for a second to sort of set a background about what's happening in environmental justice in rural areas. Before we really get to what right to farm laws, we need to understand what some of the backdrop is and how these right to farm laws are just sort of a cog in this theme we've been talking about, that's a failure in systems and kind of destroying some community autonomy. So Danny, if you want to take that.
Great. Thank you, Alan. And again, many thanks to Austin and David and everyone else that helped bring us together for this conversation. As Alan mentioned, I'm going to talk just briefly about the backdrop for this paper, which revolves around environmental justice in rural areas. And I will say, while the environmental justice movement has gained traction over time, it's only been more recently that social space, and more specifically, rural areas, have received attention as a specific dimension of environmental justice. And as Alan mentioned, our research has been multidisciplinary in nature, and we have the benefit of working with leading scholar like Dr. Loka Ashwood in social sciences that have really already looked at this issue. And so what we do know about living in rural areas is that it has legal implications, and that rural people who seek access to justice often face more barriers than their urban counterparts. And correspondingly, this can allow environmental violations of local, state, and federal laws to often go unchecked. And so research has shown that when there is a lack of access to justice, those in positions of power tend to exploit vulnerable populations, which is a problem that has been documented in communities that are dealing with the influx of CAFOs. So from this perspective, we have looked at property rights, or one's ability to assert their rights to the use and enjoyment of their property, as a specific dimension of rural power. And given that the industrial agriculture industry has in large part escaped proper environmental regulation, the ability to bring a nuisance suit against a polluting industry is sometimes one of the only viable legal mechanisms that people have to protect themselves from environmental harms. And so with that, Alan, I think I'll turn it back over to you, and maybe weigh in a little bit more later.
Okay. So what right to farm laws do is that they limit agriculture operations liability in nuisance lawsuits. That's sort of a catch-all phrase. These laws really do a lot, but if we were to summarize it down, that's sort of their primary their primary impact they have in the legal sphere. Nuisance, for those who aren't familiar, is the unreasonable interference with the use and enjoyment of property. And the best example I can think of that is actually from my hometown. There was this music venue called Clunk's Music Hall, where a bunch of punk kids were in this very suburban town making a lot of noise, bothering their neighbors. Just outside of the photo on the left is a lot of residential high-end neighborhoods that really didn't like these kinds of people hanging out in the parking lot, smoking cigarettes, things like that. So they brought a nuisance lawsuit saying that our property rights are being impacted. We can't sleep. They're playing this loud music until midnight. You're interfering with my ability to enjoy the property that I own, which is one of the rights that I have. Just like in property, I can tell someone they can't come on my property. Another right that you have that's arguably tangible is the right to enjoy that property. So that's what a nuisance lawsuit would be generally in litigation. And it's really grounded in equity, and it harmonizes competing land uses. We think about this with zoning too, where you'll zone an area being commercial where you can have businesses, zoning an area being residential. Well, nuisance lawsuits were sort of pre-zoning, where the courts would come in and say, how are we going to harmonize land uses? Because if I own property next to someone else, we both have the right to be there and we have the right to use our property. And the courts would sort of balance, if I'm interfering, if my music venue is interfering with your residential neighborhood, are there some limitations? Do I have to stop music at 11 o'clock? Do I have to tone it down? One thing that the music hall had to do is that they had to put in a bunch of sound barriers. You can see this is just a metal warehouse. They had to equitably balance their competing land uses. So that's nuisance theory generally. And out of equity is this idea of coming to the nuisance, is that priority of land use is given to those who first made use of the land. So if a suburban area moved into a traditionally rural area, they could go to court if they got sued for nuisance and say, we were here first. Our operation was here first. We're not going to stop what we're doing because someone else moved next to it and then they didn't like it. It's, again, this idea grounded in equity, that what's the most equitable way to settle competing land use issues. A quick example is a drive-in theater in the 1970s moved next to Campbell Soup's composting operation. In the summertime, the wind would blow the smell of the compost over this outdoor venue. And so the venue said, we're losing business. So they brought a nuisance lawsuit. And under this equitable coming to the nuisance defense, Campbell Soup didn't have to do anything. They were there first. They had had their operation in existence for several years before the theater, the drive-in came into town. They already knew it was there, so they couldn't. In equity, you couldn't say that this newcomer could stop this other legitimate business. But with urban sprawl, you can see, we all know that society started to move into these traditionally agriculture areas, and you have situations like this where you'll have a residential house where someone else is spraying very smelly fertilizer all over their agriculture land. Well, that's going to create tensions between these types of land uses, because that's a smelly operation, and that's going to be a problem for someone who's just trying to live in that structure. So obviously nuisance and agriculture were bound to have some conflict. And in the 1970s and 1980s, right to farm laws developed this political narrative that nuisance lawsuits threatened agricultural resources. That for whatever reason, there was this, we can't really find much evidence for this, but there's this political narrative that undercuts most right to farm laws that says when nuisance lawsuits result from suburban encroachment, there's a threat to agricultural resources. They declare that agricultural land use is superior, and they mandate this coming to the nuisance defense in favor of agriculture operations. There's no real equitable balance anymore that you'll see, that I'll get into here in a second. But I'll let Danny talk about some of our research findings that have come out of our survey of these right to farm cases and how they've impacted this backdrop of equitable land use conflict resolution that courts would use. So Danny, if you want to talk about some of that.
Sounds good. Okay, so in our study, we gathered the initial right to farm statutes that were enacted and then the 2020 statutes in all 50 states, and then used Lexis and Westlaw to gather right to farm case law on a per state basis, and then did a statistical analysis of the statutory language and case law, as well as looked at parties involved in these lawsuits and who is most often prevailing. And I should note, with the legal research engines that we were using, Lexis and Nexwa, that Lexis and Westlaw, they primarily allowed us to access appellate court and higher court decisions. And so our data doesn't necessarily include evaluation of cases that didn't move beyond the trial court level or that were settled out of court. And so that is not part of our data set. However, we can still glean some patterns from the data that we did collect. And some of our preliminary findings have shown that certain right to farm law provisions that are common among different state statutes lead not only to inequitable results, but tip the scales in favor of big agribusiness and commonly CAFOs. And so this is one of the provisions is when a CAFO or an agricultural operation will receive immunity if from a nuisance lawsuit if they've been, or they could justifiably say they've been in existence for at least a year before the nuisance suit is brought. And so that's just one of those types of provisions that we see sort of favoring these industries. Additionally, our preliminary research findings indicate that defendants in these suits are most often prevailing, which means the party that the nuisance suit is brought against. And then also, both sides overwhelmingly consist of multiple party types. And so you can have a resident and a landowner, or a corporation and a CAFO. And what's interesting about that is that often, and most predominantly, CAFOs tied with corporations are prevailing in these cases most often. And so in essence, what we're seeing in the preliminary results is a pattern where CAFOs and corporations are benefiting from these statutes, often at the expense of other farmers and rural residents. And that suggests that these laws have become sort of a vehicle enabling agribusiness to externalize the cost of pollution at the expense of rural populations, other farmers, and the environment. So that's broad brush stroke findings.
Well, and I'm just going to ask all of you to wrap up just so we can leave time for questions. So if you could just take another minute or two before we transfer it over to Austin.
Sure, that was the very end of it. So really what you've done is you've disrupted literally hundreds of years of equity. There's a lot that's going on behind these laws, but really preliminarily and as an overview, you've taken this equitable idea that a community has an interest in what its community looks like, where farms are located, and exercising these property interests. And state legislatures have come behind there and say, we're always going to tip that scale in favor of agriculture, regardless of size and regardless of equity. And so what you have is that the only operations that are really threatened by nuisance lawsuits are those that are inequitable with their surrounding communities. There's not really much of a justification for any other form of agriculture other than industrial operations. That's our last slide too.
Great, thank you all so much. I'm sure we will have time to dig further into this in questions. But I think Austin's work on the commodity checkoff programs is going to complement this nicely, as it's a form of federal capture, whereas this is state capture. So Austin, I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, this piggybacks off the prior paper really well. For an example of a lot of it in these instances, it's farmers complaining about the smell from these manure operations. Yet the so-called voice of farmers, organizations like the Iowa Farm Bureau, actually supported these efforts, these pro-corporate agriculture efforts to take away power from farmers. And so that's kind of like the genesis for my paper. Honestly, it all traces back to a few years ago when someone told me to watch this episode 60 Minutes from 2000, Mike Wallace on the Iowa Farm Bureau. And so what my paper looks at is from friend to foe. I look at mission drift of both farm bureaus and commodity checkoff programs. Little history about both. This book here on the left, it's one of those historic nuggets that you find that just kind of blows your mind. It's a 1921 book I found, written by a Farm Bureau member on the history of Farm Bureau. The story of Farm Bureau, real quick, is it was started by a Chamber of Commerce in a little town south of the Finger Lakes as literally a bureau of farmers, like a farm bureau. They hired a recent college grad to basically teach local farmers the best practices, realizing that the city did better when farmers did better. This was too much work for the one young man, and so he brought on farmers to help. They then spun this off into its own county organization. The key thing that's not told in this history of Farm Bureau is the way they grew was actually, it was almost quasi of a co-op. It was a bulk buying operation. And so what I mean by that is What Farm Bureau at the county levels used to do is instead of buying individually your fertilizer, they would both buy and get a price discount. So that helped drive membership. And so what you see is it spread across the country at the county level and then at the state level and then eventually at the federal level. At the same time, this overlaps basically World War I, where the US government pushed US farmers to really surge, increase production to basically supply our allies with food as their farm fields were in battle. So what you see at this also time is a lot of federal money is being dumped into extension, which is like this way basically disseminating information from land grants. And they did this in conjunction with Farm Bureau. So you basically have this triangulation of universities, Farm Bureau, and Extension pushing information, but also farmers have an incentive, financial incentive to join because they get a discount. So that's how this rapid growth. And what you see, for example, in the Iowa Farm Bureau is they basically create an insurance, a little insurance company geared towards their members, selling auto insurance. And that organization slowly grew. And what you see is they basically bought or merged with local other Farm Bureau insurance companies. The history of the checkoffs, this also goes back to a few years later, World War II era. You have this agriculture depression. The Florida legislature basically enacts a tax on the growers of oranges, grapefruits, and tangerines. You basically tax the product. You set up a committee to then advertise the product. And so there's some legal cases around the legality of this. That was settled, and then other states did the same thing. Like Iowa created one for milk. These are small in comparative sense. The first federal one was like in the 50s, 60s. I think it was wool or sheep, lamb. You didn't really see them surge until the late 80s. And that Got Milk is the most famous example of it. You have about 20 of these at the federal level now, 20 some. What they do is basically, what you see with the deregulation of the Farm Bill in the 80s, 90s is what used to be how do we manage supply, produce just enough so farmers make good money, companies pay an affordable price and inputs, but then we're also managing the ecological needs of our environment. Now you basically have a model. The Farm Bill is built for Wall Street. It's built for overproducing a few key things. So how do we essentially find new uses for overproduction? And checkoffs really filled that void. What's really fascinating too is Farm Bureau's evolution on its position of checkoffs. They really did not like checkoffs when they were the first idea was proposed for a federal one. The president at the time said, quote, an invasion of individual freedom of choice. You have to keep in mind farms of that era, think of them like a retirement fund. You want to have multiple revenue streams in case one market collapses. You don't put all your stock, all your retirement money on Enron, which is kind of like what checkoffs are doing, because checkoffs only care about that one thing, promoting that one thing at the expense of the others. To now, fast forward, the current platform of the Farm Bureau is it wants more checkoffs. So the mission drift. So when we talk about mission drift, what I'm really talking about is just a few key bad apples here. I'm not talking about the Maine Farm Bureau. The Maine Farm Bureau has an operating budget of $250,000, Minnesota $3 million. Iowa, on the other hand, has $120 million here, 116, I'm sorry. In the appendix of my paper, I have all the revenue for all farm bureaus for all 50 states for 10 years. So feel free to dig in there. But the Iowa now is as big as 34 states combined. But what you see over the last 10 years, essentially, we saw a third of the hog farmers in Iowa collapse, yet at the same time, the budget of the Iowa Farm Bureau tripled. They'll tell you they have a lot of members, but that's kind of, I want to say BS. I can't think of a better word right now. But basically, in order to get their insurance, you have to you become a member. So basically, as family farms collapse in Iowa, this organization gets bigger. Why? It's because the insurance company just took off. Insurance is regulated at the state. It's a whole conversation for later. Iowa is to insurance what Delaware is to corporations. Only about 3% of Iowa Farm Bureau's revenue comes from membership dues anymore. It's all from its ownership stake in this insurance company. For reference, Texas Farm Bureau has about 72% of its operating budget comes from membership dues. This is a whole nother nonprofit law. If there's any nonprofit lawyers on here, but basically even the president of the Farm Bureau is not even paid by the Farm Bureau, he's paid by the for-profit. Their current policy platform has no mention of climate change, antitrust, concentration, or monopoly. I don't think I make your profit on investment income in between. So more concentrated markets are, the more higher return your investments will be. And so the Farm Bureau in Iowa has a financial, because it's dominated and controlled by a for-profit and suburban insurance company in West Des Moines, it wants concentration. It benefits from it. It has investments in fossil fuels, about $500 million of investments in fossil fuels. That to me explains why you see this mission drift of them. It's common sense to have a plan on climate change in 2020 for farmers, yet they don't. Sorry, I'm moving fast. My paper lays this out more. With checkoffs, the big problem with checkoffs too is vertical integration, as that prior paper mentioned. Now the largest owner of, I just realized this recently, the pork powerhouse is based on sows, which are the mama pigs. And so the actual number of hogs they own is way more than that. So now you have this quasi-Chinese state-owned corporation, the largest owner. So they're now the largest payer into the pork checkoff. And so there's example after example after example of just these checkoffs acting in the interests of the corporate interests, and to the largest payer into the programs. Dairy it's a whole different beast. This is just, I know Connor's paper earlier on dairy talked about this. This is an example of a modern, quote, dairy farm. It's near Clovis, New Mexico. This should be a desert, yet we're taking water from aquifer that cannot support it to a bunch of cows that basically live in a manure pit all day. This is what the dairy checkoff basically acts in the interest of. I know Sarah Lloyd's on this call. She's a Wisconsin dairy farmer, and she's done a lot of work to really expose this corruption. The other thing to highlight too about the mission drift of checkoffs are two things. One, you're basically giving two contradictory dietary guidelines that the government's putting out. You have organizations that are very well resourced, basically pushing consumers to do one thing when the government says another thing. As we also see in this chart makes very clear, with the deregulation of the American food system, you see the obesity crisis take off. And I think I also really recommend this book called The Cigarette, A Political History. And this tells a really good dark story on the power and influence of the tobacco checkoff and how that really planted a lot of the doubt that prevented America from addressing the smoking crisis the past century. My paper concludes with reforms. One is just enacting that Booker, Mike Lee bill, Opportunities for Fairness, basically putting transparency to checkoffs, having a provision where farmers have to then every 10 years agree to vote to keep the checkoff alive. There's plenty of shenanigans with the pork checkoff where farmers actually voted to do that, to disband the program. George Bush administration came in and threw it out. There's instances of the dairy like that too. For Farm Bureau is basically, unless my proposal is about at least half of your money needs to come from member paying dues, or you lose your nonprofit tax status. And then finally, I encourage anyone to just more in the appendices I also went through about the majority of Farm Bureau's policy platforms, about 37 of them, and looked at their antitrust and climate change positions, and we have that catalog there. Most of them actually support antitrust action, yet most of them do not support climate change action if you even deny it. That is my paper, and feel free to reach out or suggest any other reforms. That was a mile a minute.
But I appreciate you going so fast, because that leaves us some time for questions. And